GB understands that the King and Queen have hosted the Duke and Duchess of Sussex with Prince Archie.
Only 5 minutes ago, an announcement attributed to Buckingham Palace changed the atmosphere surrounding the monarchy. King Charles had reportedly called an emergency council meeting. But this was not described as a routine family discussion, a ceremonial briefing, or another adjustment to the royal calendar. The subject was far more sensitive: succession security. Within minutes, senior advisors were said to be moving through palace corridors. Private schedules were cleared. Security officials were contacted. And urgent messages were reportedly sent to Prince William and Princess Anne. The statement was brief, almost unnaturally brief. It confirmed that the meeting concerned the continuity of the crown, but offered no explanation for why that continuity suddenly required emergency attention. Charles appeared composed. The palace language sounded controlled. Yet every carefully selected word created another unsettling question. Why had the meeting been called without warning? Why were William and Anne summoned with such urgency? Why was the future of the crown suddenly being discussed behind closed doors? And perhaps most strangely, why was Queen Camilla not mentioned in the initial account at all? The palace had apparently identified a concern serious enough to trigger immediate action, but too sensitive to explain publicly. And in royal life, silence rarely ends speculation. It multiplies it. Because the most alarming detail was not simply that an emergency meeting had been called. It was the name reportedly placed at the center of the security discussion. And when William learned whose safety was being questioned, his first response was not about becoming king. It was about protecting his son. To understand why this meeting would carry such weight, you first have to understand how the palace normally operates. Private royal discussions happen constantly. Constitutional briefings, security reviews, travel planning, state preparations, family disagreements. Most are handled quietly. No dramatic announcement is issued. The public may never know they took place. But an emergency council is different. It signals that ordinary channels are no longer considered sufficient. And according to this dramatized scenario, the room would not contain only members of the royal family. Constitutional advisors were expected, senior security officials, trusted palace staff, possibly representatives responsible for royal residences, communications, travel coordination, and continuity planning. That changed the meaning of a gathering. When experts responsible for the survival of the institution are called into the same room, the conversation is no longer about ceremonies or appearances. It is about what happens when the normal order breaks down. One phrase was reportedly repeated throughout the briefing: continuity of the crown. It sounds calm, administrative, almost reassuring. But behind it sits a question no palace wants to answer before it becomes necessary. What happens if King Charles suddenly cannot perform the full responsibilities of the monarch? No abdication had been announced. No permanent transfer of royal authority had been confirmed. But the possibility was now close enough to be discussed. And once William entered that conversation, the meeting became more than a security review. It became a discussion about the next reign. Princess Anne's presence added another layer. Charles did not only want the heir in the room. He wanted the royal known for discipline, experience, and saying what others might be too cautious to say. But one question still remained unanswered. Was this simply responsible planning? Or had the palace uncovered something that made waiting impossible? Then William received a private call. And whatever he heard reportedly changed his entire demeanor. William had been reviewing upcoming engagements when the message arrived. At first, there was no obvious reason for alarm. Royal schedules change constantly. Meetings are moved. Appearances are adjusted. Security arrangements evolve without public explanation. But this message was different. He was being summoned to an emergency council concerning 3 specific matters: succession readiness, continuity of authority, and the protection of the next generation. Those words carried a weight no heir could ignore, because succession was not an abstract constitutional concept for William. It was his future, Catherine's future, and eventually Prince George's. William's first concern was reportedly not whether he would receive more authority. He wanted to know whether palace officials believed his family faced a new danger. Would Catherine's schedule need to change? Would the children's movements be restricted? Would George's public appearances be reduced? The answer was cautious. No confirmed immediate threat had been identified. But officials reportedly believed that the current system might not withstand every possible emergency. That uncertainty was almost more disturbing than a direct warning. Because when security is reviewed at this level, someone has usually found a vulnerability. The unanswered question is whether that weakness remains theoretical, or whether someone has already come close to exploiting it. Catherine reportedly noticed the change in William before he explained anything. He became quieter, more focused, less interested in the rest of the day's routine. Before departing, he was instructed to bring only essential staff and to discuss the meeting with no one outside the closest family circle. That instruction transformed an urgent briefing into something far more serious. William had spent his entire life preparing to become king one day. But one day feels very different when the palace suddenly begins planning, as though that day might arrive sooner than expected. Then William asked the question that stripped away every constitutional formality. Is George in danger? The answer was not the reassurance he wanted. Officials could not point to a confirmed threat against the young prince. But they had identified what they described as a dangerous gap in the system. A gap that could become critical during a sudden royal transition. And it was not limited to physical protection. It involved travel schedules, private communications, access to residences, staff permissions, vehicle movements, digital information, and the transfer of sensitive instructions between separate royal households. Under normal circumstances, each system operated independently. But during a national or royal emergency, they might all need to work simultaneously. That was where advisors reportedly believed the crown had become vulnerable. William's public movements could be planned months in advance. Catherine's appearances attracted intense attention, and George's future position meant that even small fragments of his routine carried unusual sensitivity. The problem was not that one person possessed the entire family schedule. The problem was that too many people may have possessed separate pieces of it. A driver knew one movement. A residence team knew another. A communications office knew the timing. A public events team knew the location. Separately, those details appeared harmless. Combined, they could reveal far more than intended. Nothing had happened yet. That distinction mattered. But Charles reportedly refused to wait for an actual failure. He ordered a full review. Who could access William's movements? How quickly could the Wales family be relocated? Which royal residence would become operational during a crisis? Who would control communication if the king became temporarily unavailable? How many senior heirs should appear at the same location? And who would make immediate decisions before constitutional guidance arrived? Some officials recommended immediate restrictions. Others warned that visible changes would create panic. Charles faced two dangerous options. Move too slowly, and the crown might remain exposed. Move too aggressively, and Britain might believe the palace was already preparing for catastrophe. Then advisors introduced a proposal that changed the mood inside the room. It did not merely strengthen security. It threatened to divide the family. The proposal appeared simple. Reduce William's public movements. Limit George's appearances. Reassess Catherine's schedule. And temporarily place the entire Wales household under stricter security control. From an institutional perspective, the argument was logical. William was first in line. George was second. Any weakness affecting them could become a constitutional concern. Charles reportedly listened as advisors outlined the restrictions. Fewer unscheduled appearances. More controlled travel. Greater secrecy. Reduced advance notice. And temporary limits on occasions where multiple senior heirs gathered in the same place. On paper, it sounded responsible. Inside a family, it sounded suffocating. William objected. He accepted that George needed protection. But he refused to allow his son to grow up believing that royal duty made ordinary life impossible. George already carried expectations far beyond his age. More restrictions could turn responsibility into fear. Catherine reportedly supported stronger safeguards, but only if they remained proportionate. She did not want George, Charlotte, and Louis to see altered routines, increased officers, and canceled plans and assume something terrible was about to happen. Camilla reportedly raised a different danger. If William and Catherine suddenly vanished from public life, the country would not interpret it as routine caution. It would see panic. Rumors would explode. Was Charles gravely ill? Was William preparing to assume power? Had the palace received a direct threat? Had something happened to George? The attempt to protect the monarchy could accidentally persuade the public that the monarchy was already in crisis. Then Princess Anne leaned forward. She had allowed the advisors to complete their presentation. Now she asked the question no one had answered. Who decided this threat was serious enough to restrict the future king and his children? No one responded immediately, and had reportedly grown frustrated with the language. Officials spoke about vulnerability, potential exposure, continuity, emergency readiness. But they had still not identified a confirmed attack, a named source, or one event that justified transforming family protection into controlled isolation. Was the concern based on verified intelligence? Had independent experts reached the same conclusion? Or had palace officials imagined the worst possible scenario and then constructed a crisis around it? That distinction mattered. Because once fear is given authority, it can justify almost anything. William listened carefully. Part of him wanted every possible safeguard introduced immediately. Another part understood Anne's warning. If every theoretical danger became a reason to hide George, the future heir might never be allowed to live beyond the walls built to protect him, and reminded the room that monarchy depended on visibility. The public had to see those who represented it. An heir protected so completely that he became distant could eventually appear less like a national figure and more like a guarded symbol. Charles pushed back. Tradition could not be allowed to weaken security, and agreed. But caution and control were not the same thing. Protection must serve the family, she reportedly argued. The family must not become a prisoner of protection. The room shifted. Even advisors who had supported the restrictions began to reconsider how far they should go. Then, and demanded the full review, not the shortened summary, not the version prepared for senior royals, the complete document. And what officials produced changed the meaning of the entire meeting. Because the emergency had not begun that morning. The palace had reportedly been studying the issue for weeks. Only a small circle of officials, constitutional advisors, and security specialists had known. The confidential review had one purpose: to determine whether the monarchy could continue functioning if Charles became temporarily unable to perform every part of his role. It examined several possibilities: a medical interruption, a travel disruption, a breakdown in secure communication, a situation where the king remained sovereign but could not sustain his normal schedule. None of these scenarios automatically meant abdication. None confirmed a permanent transfer. But together they exposed an uncomfortable truth. The palace was relying on procedures designed for a more predictable age. Modern royal life was faster, more visible, more digitally connected, and more vulnerable to confusion. The review reportedly found not one catastrophic failure, but several smaller gaps. Responsibilities based on informal understandings. Unclear emergency communication routes. Overlapping household authority. Uncertain public roles. Each weakness appeared manageable alone. Combined, they could create chaos. If Charles temporarily stepped back, William might be expected to absorb an enormous workload immediately, and could be required to carry more public duties. Camilla's public presence could expand even though her constitutional powers would not. Catherine's recovery, family responsibilities, and public role would all have to be considered. And every movement involving George would become more sensitive. and was reportedly furious that plans involving the entire family had progressed without the family being consulted. William felt something different. Not anger. Alarm. Officials had been making plans about his wife, his children, and his future without his knowledge. Charles defended the secrecy. The review had begun as a precaution. He had not wanted rumors to spread before advisors knew whether the weaknesses were serious. But weaknesses had been identified, and reached the final scenario. The one Charles had reportedly refused to discuss until now. What would happen if King Charles remained sovereign, but became temporarily unable to perform the full duties of the crown? Not abdication, not the end of his reign. A period of uncertainty. Charles would still be king, but the normal pace of state business could no longer depend entirely upon him. Who would receive urgent constitutional briefings? Who would represent the crown at national events? How much responsibility could William assume without appearing to replace his father? And how could the palace explain the arrangement without creating panic? Charles understood the danger. Preparation could be interpreted as surrender. Silence could leave the monarchy unprepared. The proposed answer was a phased continuity plan. William would receive expanded constitutional briefings and would prepare for greater public responsibility. Camilla could represent Charles at selected ceremonial events. Communication protocols would be modernized. Emergency authority would be defined before it was needed. William immediately recognized the trap. Too much preparation could make him appear eager for the throne. Too little could leave the country without visible leadership. Charles looked around the room and acknowledged the truth they had all avoided. The crown could not depend on one person being available every hour of every day. It needed a system strong enough to survive uncertainty. Then Charles turned toward William. The meeting was no longer about documents. It was about inheritance. And what the king asked of his son next changed the emotional direction of the entire council. Charles did not speak like a monarch addressing an heir. For a moment, he spoke like a father preparing his son for a burden that no longer felt distant. He asked William to begin preparing immediately for a larger role. Not because Charles was stepping aside, not because power was being transferred, but because the monarchy could no longer treat succession as a problem for another day. William would receive deeper constitutional access. He would study emergency procedures, state responsibilities, private briefing systems, and decisions that could fall to him with almost no warning. Charles made one principle clear. Readiness must never resemble ambition. William accepted the responsibility, but set a boundary. He would support the king. He would serve the crown. But Catherine and the children would not become casualties of palace planning. Catherine needed stability. George needed time to remain a child. Charlotte and Louis deserved a home that did not feel like an emergency headquarters. Charles listened. Then his tone reportedly softened. Protecting the family was not separate from protecting the monarchy. It was part of the same duty. And the king asked William to make one promise. Do not let George grow up too quickly. That request silenced the room, because the discussion was no longer about crowns, procedures, or public appearances. It was about the inheritance of pressure. Outside the council chamber, Catherine was being briefed, and her first question exposed the human cost the advisors had almost overlooked. How will we explain this to the children? George was old enough to notice increased security. Charlotte would recognize sudden schedule changes. Louis could sense tension even if no one explained it. Catherine supported necessary safeguards. But children could not be expected to live comfortably inside a crisis they did not understand. She reportedly accepted fewer predictable movements, stricter access to information, greater care around events involving multiple heirs. But she insisted on limits. George could be protected without being made to feel watched. William could be prepared without treating Charles as though his reign had ended. The monarchy could become safer without allowing fear to dominate their home. For Catherine, the issue was not simply preparing a future king. It was preserving the father her children still needed. But the final decision belonged to Charles. When he returned to the council chamber, the debate ended. There would be no alteration to the line of succession. No one would be removed. No abdication would be announced. No permanent authority would be transferred. But the palace would begin an immediate continuity and security overhaul. William would receive expanded briefings and would oversee practical implementation. Camilla would continue supporting and representing Charles where appropriate. Catherine would be included in every decision affecting the children. Access to full family schedules would be reduced. Communication between royal residences would be reviewed. Travel involving multiple senior heirs could be adjusted. Emergency responsibilities would be clarified. Charles rejected the most extreme restrictions. Protection would not become imprisonment. William and George would remain visible, but their movements would be less predictable. Then Charles reportedly delivered the sentence that defined the meeting. The crown must never be left unprepared. It was not an announcement that his reign was ending, but its meaning was unmistakable. Charles was no longer preparing only for the monarchy he currently led. He was preparing the family for the monarchy that would follow him. By the time the council ended, no crown had changed hands, but something inside the palace had shifted. William left with more responsibility, but no greater certainty, and emerged as the strongest internal challenge to both fear and tradition. Catherine remained focused on protecting the children from the emotional cost of succession planning, and Charles confronted the truth every monarch must eventually face. The crown may appear permanent. The person carrying it is not. Perhaps this was simply responsible preparation, or perhaps it marked the first quiet stage of a transition the palace was not yet prepared to announce. Because the crown is inherited in a moment, but the burden of carrying it begins long before. So what do you believe? Was King Charles merely strengthening the monarchy's security? Or was he preparing William for a transition sooner than anyone expected? Subscribe to Royal Latest Report for the next royal development.